Welcome everyone to Monday Night Program. So tonight I'm going to introduce Mr. Art Taylor. He was born in Richmond, Virginia. He was the past president of the Hanover County Historical Society, where he served 6 terms. He was also the past president of the Richmond chapter Sons of the American Revolution, and a whole bunch of other things that I could read. There's a long list. But in short, he's also a published author. He has one of those books with him tonight that he'll talk about at the end if you're interested. He also is part-time. He researches genealogy, a history researcher with a focus on Hanover County. And with that, I will let him take it from here.
Good evening. It's good to be here. Fine food, needless to say. I was fortunate enough to have it bestowed upon me tonight, so I'm gonna be going to sleep about halfway through, just y'all. But we'll try to keep each other awake. How about that? As I was introduced, I am Art Taylor, and I'll claim that. I think she told you that I have worn several hats. History is one of them. I worked for VDOT for 32 years, stuff like that. So I enjoy what I'm doing. I tell people that when I make a presentation like this, I'm kind of old school because everybody has a nice PowerPoint presentation or something like that, and I'm not a PowerPoint guy. I was working at VDOT when computers started, so that makes me dangerous, and I never went to a PowerPoint class, so I still don't PowerPoint. I just play around with it and have fun with it, and I'm old school from the standpoint that I like to be a little bit more tangible. For example, I'm going to pass these around, and I just want y'all to just pass them around and say that you handled them, okay? And I got one more I'll take to the back. Hopefully they're not that heavy, but y'all just pass this around back here, and they'll eventually get back up front. Like I said, I'm kind of old-fashioned, and I like to have things that are tangible, that you can't break if you touch it. I'm passing something around that no doubt you can't break. Hopefully you can handle it, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. I always try to start off, because we live in Hanover County, and I've been over here before. I don't know whether any of y'all have been in it, but I think I talked to a group over here about Hanover history. And then y'all had a presentation on railroads not too long ago, I think she said. And I don't know that it got into a lot of history. So I switched mine to go with railroads tonight and talk more about Hanover railroads per se. And maybe I'll fill in some of the gaps. But one of the things I always try to start out with is the word perspective. And the best my good definition of perspective that I use in presentations of this nature, and I'll do the first person, I know who I am, where I came from, and how I got here. So if we know that, then we've got some perspective. And I started messing around with genealogy, and how many of y'all have been here long enough that you knew Helen Yates, who was here? All right, I know Bob Tate knew her, but Helen Yates, and so anyway, she's one of the ones that kind of got me into Hanover Historical Society, and she was a consummate genealogist. In other words, she was a professional genealogist, and she only would go with sourced material. That is stuff you could prove. And so I learned from her a lot of how I am now. So as a result, I know who I am, where I came from, and how I got here. That's one of the best definitions of perspective that I've kind of made up. Probably stole it from somebody, to be honest with you, because I know somebody else has said it. I doubt there's many words today that people can utter that have never been spoken before, including phrases. But the best definition of all that I did not steal, and I can't claim it, is Hanover's native son. Hanover has 2 famous native sons. One of them is Patrick Henry from Studley, and the other one is Henry Clay. But Patrick Henry, in that little inconsequential speech that he gave March 1775, I think it was down at that little small church in Richmond called St. John's Church. He had a line that comes out of that is the best definition of perspective that I've heard, and that line basically, out of context, says, I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. And that's what's given us a fit today, because we don't know that, pardon the French, we screwed up because people don't know what happened yesterday. And that's part of the problem we're facing. And that's why I like to do things like this and talk about these things, because today we know how fast we can go down the road in a car, but this is the first railroad right here. I'll talk about that in just a second. And the other part of this is that I started with, I tell people that if I don't learn something new every day, I must be dead, in all seriousness, because there's very seldom a day that goes by, if I think about it, I can remember that I learned something new. Today, or yesterday, I learned something new because I was looking for the first article for the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad when it ran. And I finally dug it out today. And it's got a picture of it in this, but it's hard to read. I'll talk about this book too. And let me say this too. As I go along, if y'all got a question, please feel free to do this, because I can be interrupted. I won't promise you I'll get right back on track, but I'll try to answer your question, or if it's somewhere I'm going, I'll tell you I'm going there, okay? So don't hesitate to ask me something. But I learned something new because I found these newspaper articles, and it sheds a lot of light on it. For example, to get ahead of myself a little bit, the first train that ran was the R.F.P. Railroad train in 1836, okay? And they were screaming up through the country from Richmond to Hanover Junction, actually almost to the South Hanover River. How many of y'all know where the Ashland Roller Mill is on Route 1, all right? The first R.F.P. Railroad train ran from 8th Street Station in Richmond to a steam mill near south of the South Hanover River. I haven't found out where that steam mill is. So if anybody has any background history on where that might have been, but it was before you got to the river. So I know that Ashland Roller Mill is a good, if you know where it is, that's a good point of reference. But that was the very first run of this train. I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But that's one of the things that I keep ducking my head, and this thing is just picking it up louder and less loud. But that's one of the things that I learned. And my topic today, and I don't know exactly how it was listed, but it's called, let's talk a little Hanover history. Hanover's 4 railroads, if you include the Ashland Trolley Line, okay? And I say that a little facetiously because I got 2 20th century railroads in here, really. But the first one, I'm going to start with the oldest one. Well, really, let me back up to do this. The oldest railroad in Virginia is where? Anybody know where that might be? You don't count. No, you're right. He's right. The first railroad that ran in Virginia was the Chesterfield Coal Railroad, as I call it, okay? And the unique thing about that, and I'm gonna say this, that piece of wood, that wood I handed y'all and y'all passed around, this is a piece of the original first wooden rail, that this piece of flat iron was put on and the trains ran on it, okay? And I have not researched it and found it, but I'm going to tell you from what I know about the research that in all probability, the 1828 Chesterfield Railroad, which actually didn't start running until about 1831, I think it was chartered or something like that in 1828, it almost had to have run on this type of thing right here. Piece of wood with a big piece of iron spiked on top of it. This is what your first railroad was. And contrary to what I thought I knew, the gauge of the railroads today is 4 foot 8.5 inches. This railroad, when it went down, guess what the gauge was? 4 feet 8.5 inches. I was told that the early railroads were narrow. A lot of people call them narrow gauge railroads. but from what I've researched and from what I've since been told, it was 4 foot 8.5 inches. Everything that I've got that I've researched and got up here, 4 feet 8.5 inches. So that's what you've got in between. Now, to summarize real quick the 4 railroads I'm going to talk about, don't count the Chesterfield, because I just talked about that. Now, the other interesting thing about the Chesterfield Railroad is it was a gravity railroad. Y'all know what I'm talking about, a gravity railroad? Didn't have any engines. And the main reason was, let me back up and say this. Has anybody ever seen the 1835 Micah Bates map of Richmond, Virginia? This is something else I learned one day. He knows about it. Now, do you know what's in the lower right-hand corner of that map? If I hadn't looked down to where the legend is of Micah Bates map, 1835 Richmond, Virginia, right down there in that corner, in the edge of Richmond, sits the coal pits, coal docks for where the coal came down from the Midlothian coal mines. The railroad came right down the hill, about where the Mayo Bridge crosses now, and when it got down to the river level, basically speaking, it hung a right and went east down the James River. And where these coal piers are, from what I can tell, and I don't think they were piers like we know them, but where these coal piers are, or were, was about where the original Bloody Run Creek came into the James River, across the river, which is downstream from where the thing is today. That's where Chief Powhatan, I think it was Powhatan, got killed at the Battle in Richmond, where he was killed. He was the chief of the, no, I take it back. It's Pamunkey, is of the Hanover Indians, so to speak. He was killed in Richmond. There's an interesting thing on that if you want to Google it. But that map shows where those piers were. I didn't have a clue where they were, so I found out. But the Gravity Railroad was, and you know a lot about that. Now, do you know the elevation between the river and Midlothian by any chance? And also, I don't know it either. But it was high enough that when they filled the cars up, they had a special contraption, a rope, I forget what they called it, I ran across this too, that they would lower, they'd start the cars down the rail towards the river. And they had a rope system on it to where they slowed them down. And they let them down 2 at a time, took them down to the coal piers, dumped them, and they were letting them down like that. And that's how they mined the coal in the pits up there, in the mines. Say again? How'd they get the cars back up? All right. The one thing they probably had for sure was horses, mules, and whatever else. But the other thing was, and this is where they minimized the horse part of it, I ran across this. They had a ratchet-type rope machine that they let the things down with, and they could pull the empty cars back up with this contraption. Now, I think it's 9 miles. So if they were running it over 9 miles, pulling it back up, they had more than one. But the bottom line was they had to get them back up there, and it was by animal power or human power or ratchet or something like that. To digress just a minute, this is basically, I know you can't see it, this is basically, and I want to encourage you afterwards to please come up here and feel free to look at anything, but this is one of the first engines that ran on this railroad and the Louisa Railroad. And all your engines up to, I almost say pushing into probably 1850 were made in England, from what I've been able to research. Then they started making some at Tredegar and not Baldwin, I can't think of the other name of it, but regardless, they were in the 1840s going into the 50s. That's when they started making them in this country. Your rolling stock was made in this country, that is passenger cars and, freight cars and stuff like that. But that's a little thing. Now, let me give you a quick summary on these things. The first railroad that I'm going to talk about is, of course, the RF&P Railroad. That was 27 miles from Richmond to the South Allen River. The next one I'm talking about, but really the first railroad, and I have to wean myself, was really the Richmond-Fredericksburg line, because although it was called the RF&P, it didn't get to Potomac yet, so therefore it was the Richmond-Fredericksburg line. The next railroad I'm going to talk about is, today it's known as the Buckingham Branch. A good portion of it is called the Buckingham Branch Railroad from Buckingham, Virginia. They've taken over a great part of it through this area, all the way up through Hanover County, going out west in Virginia. They got that from the CSX Railroad. And I think, I've been told that there's a real close connection, like one part might be Union and the Buckingham branch might be non-Union. I don't know how true that is, but I just know that there's a connection between the Buckingham branch and the CSX Railroad. Part of the railroad, as you get further out, is still CSX. But through this area here, it's the Buckingham branch up through Hanover County anyway. I know up through Beaver Dam where I live, the original line's still basically there. And you don't see anything Buckingham branch engines on that. But you still got the same traffic coming through, but they've done a heck of a job of fixing it up. All right, now the history of the Buckingham branch, and I'm gonna go backwards. CSX was before the Buckingham branch. The C&O Railroad, which was the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, preceded the CSX Railroad. The Virginia Central Railroad preceded the C&O Railroad, and the Louisa Railroad preceded the Virginia Central Railroad. So that had a nice long succession, starting in 1836. 37, I'll talk about that, all right? And then I told you I was going to talk a little bit about the Chesterfield Railroad, which doesn't count. But then Richmond had another railroad that came through Hanover County that ran through a good part of Hanover County. It was called the Richmond-Rappahannock River Railway Line. And it ran from, I've got it down there, something Gardens in Richmond, all the way to the Pamunkey River where Broadus' Flat is. That's as far as it got. A lot of stuff stopped at Broadus' Flat. But this railroad was designed to go down, I call it a Turisto Railroad, because what did developers start to do when everything was crowding up in Richmond and Hanover County? Everybody wanted to go to the river. So this railroad was designed to be built to go down to the Rappahannock area, the rivers, and for development, for tourists and everything else. But it never got past the Pamunkey River for some reason. It went belly up is what basically it did. And then the other one is the Richmond-Ashland Electric Streetcar Line. I call it the Ashland Trolley Line. I'll talk some more about that. But that's just a quick synopsis of what we're going to talk about for sure on the railroads. Now, to kind of get down to business, I'm not going to get into a lot of dates and depth on this thing other than to maybe mention when it was chartered, when the first train ran, tell you a little bit about that first train that ran, and maybe take you up to the Civil War. I will tell you this, that if you know, how many of y'all are kind of Civil War historians, okay? And I ask you that for the simple reason, if you look at the defenses of Richmond during the Civil War, and you look at the strategic importance of railroads, you'll see how Lee and everybody else defended things. A real good example of that is, how many of y'all have ever been up to the North Anna Battlefield up on Verdon Road in semi-western Hanover County? Great walking trails. You can walk a lot of them, but the blue trail, as they called it, which goes out into the Yankee side of it, it goes down like that. So if it's wet, you're going down on your backside. But they got some of the best trails out there, the best interpreted trails, and the best laid out trails around. I was involved with a lot of that, working with that some. But that is a good example of strategy of Lee during the war. His basic thing was, when the Union pulled out of the Fredericksburg area, Grant moved them down on the other side of the North Anna River. So Lee mirrored them all the way down to keep his army between them and Richmond. At the same time, Lee's goal was to protect the rail line. If you look at Hanover Junction, which is up at Doswell, most of y'all know where Doswell is, all right? That, and you're a railroad man, I have not seen much to substantiate this, but that's one of the few at-grade crossings that I know of around, at least in this immediate area, to where you've got two major railroads until the RF&P was taken over by the CSX Railroad. But can you imagine with two major railroads, you got the RF&P was built, needless to say, from Richmond to the Potomac, north-south. But the Louisa came along and was built east-west, so to speak, although it started at Hanover Junction, because the RF&P, when it was chartered, had exclusive rights to all traffic, rail traffic, if you would, between Richmond and Washington. So when the C&O, really the Virginia Central, wanted to go to Richmond, they had to come up and get through that RF&P legislative action that gave them exclusive rights to it. I got a little bit more on that, and I just want to summarize that now. So they got that done, and that also entered into the fray, if you would, a little bit when the Ashland Trolley Line was created, because there was another railroad going from Ashland south to Richmond. But that was already taken care of, so to speak. All right, as I said, the Chesterfield Railroad was actually chartered in February 1828. It didn't go into operation until 1831, and that's considered the first railroad in Virginia. Now, something else as an aside, I got crazy one day and I said, I'm going to Google Virginia's railroads. I like to croak. Now, I'm talking about, remember how I described the C&O Railroad as the Louisa, the Virginia Central, the C&O, the CSX, and the Buckingham Branch? That counts as 5 railroads in this. But in that little jewel right there, and you can Google it yourself, if you got a printer, it's 200 railroads by name in in Virginia. That kind of warped my sense of perspective. I couldn't believe it. And once I started thumbing through it, then I realized, it's like the Louisa going on forward. But that's a lot of railroads in Virginia. People don't realize that. But along about 1834, that's when the RF&P got started. It was chartered 25 February 1834, which was roughly 6 years after the Chesterfield Railroad. All right, and the first train ran on that 27 miles from Richmond to North Anna. The contract was let, and then in 1836, 14 February 1836, the first train ran from Richmond. I think the station was 8th Street back then, and it ran right up the middle of Broad Street from what I remember seeing. And then it came on up, ran up to South Anna River, just short of the South Anna River. That was the first section in 1836 of the RF&P Railroad. And basically, the stations were Taylorsville, and I've got an interesting thing about Taylorsville right here. Learn something new every day. How many of y'all do Facebook? Not many? All right, if you do, there's a very interesting group to join. It doesn't cost you anything, and you don't get inundated with garbage. It's called Old Richmond, Virginia Images or something like that. Now, the beauty of it is they're putting up a ton of Hanover history on that thing. And the guy that Christopher, I can't think of his last name, he writes some tremendous history that's well sourced. It backs up most everything that I've researched on it. But this popped up on it, and this was called, if I wrote it down, this was called the Stage Tavern at Taylorsville. This tavern was in Hanover County, and it showed up on that. The guy is in the 1850 census. He's there as a hotel keeper, and then one of the early stops that extended past the South Anna River was basically at this tavern. This tavern is just south of where Route 30 crosses 95 to go over to King's Dominion. So between Route 1 and King's Dominion, there's a road that runs down to Taylorsville. This tavern was there, and this was one of the second termini, if you would, of the next building point where this tavern was. And you couple that with the stage line that we ran through there, because the road from Williamsburg to Fredericksburg was not up Telegraph Road as we know it. It came up on a diagonal from southeast of Taylorsville, right up through Taylorsville, cut over towards the Telegraph Road as we know it, and then it kind of went north. But that was the main stage line before the railroad got in there. Okay. Anybody got any questions so far? Anybody got anything that we wanted to back up on and talk about for a minute? Okay. Then we get to kind of my favorite one because, like I said, I live in Beaver Dam, and the Beaver Dam Depot is there. And that was a major supply point during the Civil War too, and it got burned 4 times pretty good. But the biggest railroad that started in Hanover County was at Hanover Junction. That was the Louisa Railroad, and it ran to Frederick's Hall. And I have the article here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Now, she did task me to make sure this thing went till after 9 o'clock tonight, so I could read. Oh, okay, I could read this. No, I'm just kidding with you. But anyway, remember I told you that the RF&P Railroad, when that opened, they were screaming up through the country at 10 miles an hour. This one right here, when this one opened a year later, they were screaming up using RF&P engines and RF&P rolling stock, because RF&P owned a piece of this one, and they were basically the same railroad. So what you see here in the way of this piece of flat iron, these spikes, and that wood that you handled, this is all the same because it's a year apart when it was constructed, so they were running on the same stuff. And the engine that I showed you here, that was RF&P rolling stock. But this, a year later, they were screaming up through the country at 15 miles an hour. And of course, if you ever took a stagecoach back in those days, it was days instead of 15 miles an hour. But this thing started, the opening thing about this is the actual article from the Richmond Enquirer, 22 December 1837. They had a reporter that covered it, and this jewel I blew it up, but it basically covered the length of a whole page from top to bottom. And the whole bottom, this whole bottom flap, if you would, this is who was there and the toasts that were made. That's how good they covered this thing. And when this train ran from Hanover Junction to Frederick's Hall, which is just over the Louisa line into Louisa County, it had a tremendous thing going on up there because they had, I don't know how many cars, they had a big festive dinner up there. They had politicians just like today, talking about things and bragging about the railroad. And one of the things that I wanted to hit on here, it opens up and says, the opening day was very fine. The expedition was even brilliant, and the company who met at Frederick's Hall, large and joyous even to enthusiasm. And they evidently had quite a feast up there. They had toasts and everything. It said 3 fine cars belonging to the RF Richmond-Fredericksburg Railroad set out from this city at 9 o'clock in the morning. And they started in Richmond. Now, keep in mind, the RF&P was built the year before. So if I'm right in my research, they left from the Broad Street Station, downtown Richmond at 8th and Broad, I think it was. And then they went to Hanover Junction. Then in Hanover Junction, they hung a left, going west, right up through Beaver Dam and everything else, to Frederick's Hall. Now, none of these stops were there in 1837, but that's what it was. But they went up there, and then here's the interesting thing. Got up, left at 9 o'clock. It says the cars returned to this city about half after 5 o'clock, after stoppages at the dinner and at the various wood and water stations. So with basically, in 12 hours, first train that ran east, north, and east and west. 12 hours time, they ran all the way from Richmond, hung a left at Hanover Junction, got to Frederick's Hall. Frederick Harris, who was the first president, lived at Frederick Hall, and they had a heck of a dinner up there. They had politicians. This article talks about who's on the train and what they were saying and toasts and everything else. And I'm not going to bore you with it because that's history that somebody else could go dig out too if you want to read it. Then the railroad, Louisa Construction completed the junction with the RF&P Hanover to Frederick's Hall in Louisa, 20 miles distance. Rolling stock, I talked about that. Here's the interesting thing. Passenger fares, this was in the same newspaper, just to give you an idea of how much it cost to ride the railroad. Passenger fares, Frederick Hall to Beaver Dam, 75 cents in 1837. All right. Frederick Hall to Hanover Junction, $1.50. Now, think about that, 1837, I got an eerie feeling that was some fairly serious money. And Frederick Hall to Richmond, $2.75. This is the first schedule that showed up in the same paper, I think, that I got the newspaper out of. So that was some right interesting stuff. And then in December of 1838, we know we were at Frederick's Hall there. The railroad opened for service to Louisa Courthouse 1 December 1838. So you figure that between, let's see, Orphan Bay Railroad opened, okay, May of 1836 to December of 1838, they had completed that thing from Frederick's Hall to Louisa Courthouse. And then, needless to say, it's moved west, and I got a cousin lives in Cincinnati, and I've been to that beautiful station out there, so I know it made it to Cincinnati. And then my son lives in the west of Indianapolis, so I know it made it to Indianapolis because I've seen all the trains and used to have to wait for one to pass up there, just like down here in Ashland. But the depot, this is interesting too, in our home area, Beaver Dam. That was built about 1840. It's probably, from everything I can see, the first brick depot built on the line. And it was raided numerous times during the Civil War. I got a guy coming down from Maryland Friday that wants me to get him in the depot, which I've got him set up to do. But what people can't fathom, you see that little, how many of y'all have seen the depot at Beaver Dam? Okay? Everybody says, oh man, they burned 500,000 rations, destroyed 500,000 rations right here in that little building. I said, no, they didn't. They had a tremendous complex there that they had to have it because that was the major supply point, and that was the importance of the railroads to the south and to the north too, because the north just didn't have to worry about them being attacked. Down here, they were attacked all the time, so they had to protect them, and they were major supply points. And that's how the Valley of Virginia was supplied, right out of Beaver Dam. That's where, for some reason, that was one of the major storage points that seems to be left unguarded most of the time because it got raided and hit real hard 2 or 3 times, destroying hundreds of thousands of rations. And but it's just as interesting there. And then here's another interesting thing. I should have talked about this earlier. Railroad man. Anybody know what this is? This is your first coupling on a railroad, from what I can tell. Now, this was not found on a railroad. A friend of my wife's contacted me and showed me a picture of this thing, and I didn't have a clue what it was. I hadn't even thought about how do you couple a train together. All right, but I have since found out that this right here is the link, and then on the round ends, they had a pin that they dropped down on each end. This thing was sticking out of a coupler piece on each car. And what they had to do, and they said there was a lot of railroad men walked around with missing fingers. Think about this. The link connector was no longer than that. So you're standing in between 2 railroad cars with no cell phone, no walkie-talkie, maybe 3 or 4 cars down the line, got somebody signaling to the engineer, come on back a little bit, come on back a little bit. And when it would back into this piece right here, then they'd drop a pin down through one end of it. And then when the car came all the way back, they had to get the other end of it. Now, you're standing there between 2 cars. And it had to be tight. But this came from a shipyard down in Tidewater, from what I understand. But that's about the right size. I have not yet seen an original. I would probably almost kill for a set of Lincoln pins. It was called a Lincoln pin connector coupler. And then another bit of information along these lines, I'm digressing a little bit, but as dangerous and hard as that thing was, this is interesting. The knuckle couplers that we see today on trains, from what I can tell in some quick and dirty research, the first patent was issued April 1873 to E.H. Janey in Alexandria, Virginia, for the knuckle coupler as we know it today, basically speaking, okay? And interestingly enough, that was 1871. They didn't pass anything mandatory, from what a guy with the C&O Railroad Museum told me, until 1890s to require that knuckle coupler as opposed to the Lincoln pin, and then I'm sure there was stuff in between. But they went 20 years, basically speaking, before they changed the coupling on those cars. but I guarantee there was probably a lot of deaths and a lot of missing hands and fingers and everything else, which wasn't funny. I'm trying to think. I was going to basically take this stuff up to the C&O Railroad, which I did, and I talked about the railroad going to the South Hanover River and then going north of there, the RFMP, and then the Louisa. So basically, anybody got any burning questions about the Louisa or to the CSX to Buckingham or about the RFMP that I might be able to help you out with? Because I wasn't going to beat this thing to death. I could sit here and read you dates all night long, but that and a quarter get you a cup of coffee. Yes, sir.
What's the other end of the Buckingham branch?
I don't know where the western termini is, and from what I could, Dillwyn, I thought it goes all the way out towards Covington. I think it goes, Dillwyn is where Buckingham is. That's where my wife's from, is Buckingham. That's where her Murphys are from. But my understanding is, and I've seen the Buckingham branch cars, because I go up to Bath County right often, and I go out 39 from Buffalo Gap, go out that way, and the railroad's there, and they got Buckingham branch engines on that. And my goal before I die is to ride the passenger train from, theoretically, Richmond to Cincinnati minimum to Indianapolis. I understand it's 13 hours, but I'm willing to do it. But it's 10 hours to drive it, so that'd be an interesting ride. But I don't know. You've asked a question, and I haven't really asked a question. I know a friend of mine's son is an engineer on that line now, and my goal is still from Hanover to ride a train just from Hanover Junction to Beaver Dam Depot, because when you get on those tracks, and the train, the Virginia Central came off of Hanover Junction, 1850-ish, and got to Clearing to go to Richmond. And then that's when they ran down to Richmond and got that, because the legislature created the RFMP and gave them those exclusive rights. But I think it was about 1850 for a good round date, and you're shaking your head yes. So that's what I use, and that's what I've seen. I think it was actually late 1840s or something like that. But anyway, now, another interesting piece. This piece of flat iron, and I'm going to hold this up. Matter of fact, I may pass this around. This is a piece of the original rail that the trains ran on, okay? It's called flat iron. It's about a ½ inch thick, 2.5 inches wide, and that's what it ran on. This is another piece of the same rail, okay? This is either used or it was a smaller piece. It's not nearly as big as this. This is probably lacking 3/4 of an inch width. Now, I got this from the C&O Railroad Museum. They found it out there in a yard back out there. But it is a piece of flat iron because it's got a spike end on it. The spikes were just driven down through the top of this. And here's one of the spikes with a head on it. That's not it. They're countersunk. So when you drive it down through there, it's flush. Now, the interesting thing is, somebody asked me about the butt end of these wooden rails right here. I think this cut right here on the end of this one and the one that's on the floor, don't worry about it, leave it there. The one that's on the floor up there, they have a notch in it. And the one that you've got your hand on the left-hand side, if you look at the top of that piece, you'll see a spike hole down through it. And I think that's how they spiked those things together. Okay? Now, you didn't want this. Here's a copy of the contract if anybody wants to look at it, of the original contract. But if you look at that piece he's holding up, they joined together right there where that notch is. Okay? But then I got the contract, and I've got a cross section here you can look at. But the biggest thing that went on when these two pieces of stuff came together, they would be butted like that. There wasn't a plate as we know them today that was holding them down, much less a plate to connect the butt ends per se. They just kind of spiked them together there. And what was happening is, as the trains ran on those things from 1837 to 1850, let's say, they started, needless to say, with the weight and everything bouncing, because you know how smooth the railroad is today. It's just level and completely smooth. No. If you watch it on a rainy day, you'll watch those railroad ties pump water too. But the bottom line was, when it was running like this, and these things are butted together like that, these things would work themselves apart. They would start to curl up, and they would come up through the bottom of the passenger cars. They were called snakeheads, okay? And they literally came up through the bottom of cars. So about 1850, that's when they went to what we call today T-rail. This could be either this one or another piece I have up here, because I got this over at Verdun. And I can't tell you, I haven't extrapolated the weight of this piece, because as you know, those of you that are railroad people, you size rail by the pounds per yard, okay? And I haven't said this is 4 inches long, it weighs X number of pounds, and extrapolated. But this could be, that's the smallest piece I got, but this came off of the railroad line over at Verdun, where the rock quarry is, if you know where that is, basically speaking. And then the other pieces I have up here, if you look at them, you can tell that almost every one of these pieces has been in some type of wreck or something, because it's splintering apart. And if you look at it real close, you can also see how when they made the stuff, it was hot and rolled. It was molten hot, and then they rolled it into the size it is and beat it down to what it is today, and that's basically how it is. And then this is a piece of more modern. I think this is not quite large size, but that's what T-rail looks like today. And if you look at the cross-section, a lot of difference. And then here's a brand new railroad spike compared to the first railroad spike. A lot of difference. But again, like everything else, it has to evolve. Talk about the engines for a second. I mentioned it early on. Dummy. That most of the engine, this came from an ice cream social at the Louisiana Historical Society that somebody pulled out, and this pretty much matches, it seems, the logos and things like that of the first engine. They were made in Richmond. This one right here, this is called the General Civil War era engine, and this is what your later engines look like right here, steam engines, of course. Okay, you're welcome to come up here and look at them. That's one of the downsides of not having PowerPoint. I can't put it up the way you all see it real good. All right, if nobody has any questions about the Louisa, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
This is just general.
Ma'am?
This is just a general question.
Okay.
I noticed the railroad tie the wooden tie that you got there is not covered in creosote. When did they start doing that?
Her question is, when did they start creosoting them? Today they're salt treating them, so I don't have a date for either one of them. I just know that was the way. But these things, if you read this contract, now this, they call it the rails of heart of pine or heart of white oak are to be the following dimensions: 15, 20, 25 feet in length. So that was a right good whale of a tree for heart of pine or heart of oak. 25 feet wide, 5 inches wide, 9 inches deep. So basically this is 5 inches supposedly on the big end, 9 inches in vertical height. That was the size of it. Now this is original contract, and I know it's 1830 something because the only thing they left out was the year, 1, 2, 3, 4. It says 1830. And then it goes on, it says, they shall be sound of sound timber, free from decay, wind shakes, and knots calculated to impair their strength or durability. And they shall be free from sap on 3 of their edges. And on the 4th edge shall not be more sap than will show for 2 inches on either side, thus affording the entire hard surface for iron to rest on. Now, somebody asked me early on, and I almost forgot to tell you, that the gauge of this railroad, maybe I mentioned it, is 4 feet 8.5 inches, just like today's was. This first railroad, 4 feet 8.5 inches. Now you had narrow stuff in some places, but think about this: if you're running a narrow spur, the cars are not going to match up if they have to pull the cars back out on the main line or vice versa. So I don't know how many they had more narrow than 4 feet 8.5 inches, if you know what I'm saying. All righty, anybody else got anything on this? All right, let's talk a little bit about, if I can get to it, Hanover's Third Railroad, as I call it. And Bobby, if any of y'all know Bob Crick at the Richmond National Battlefield Parks, he's the one that kind of helped me with this and put me on this thing. But the Richmond Rappahannock River Railway Company, called the Rappahannock Line, it basically started out in 1889, American Streetcar Railroad, 26 March from a freelance star, it says Richmond, Urbana, and Pennsylvania Railroad Company will be taken over by the Richmond Rappahannock Line, charter to be applied for. Officers are. So there you are in 1912. It's getting to be the Rappahannock Line. And it's still got to come out of Richmond. There's not a whole lot on this thing. The other thing I have here, maximum capital $300,000, $100,000 preferred stock, and $200,000 common stock. So that was to get you from Richmond to where they stopped at the Pamunkey River. And then 1912, it was bought out by the Virginia Railway Company. Then let's see, there was a change of stop in 1914. And then in 1915, from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Richmond Rappahannock Line, big promises for service to Rappahannock Land and Development Corporation on the Rappahannock River. It never got there. $1 million spent. 27.5 miles of steam and electric railroad system through communities and truck farming area, access provided to the Pamunkey Valley. So if you look at where it came out of Richmond, how many of y'all are topo map guys? I know this one over here is, because he had to get into the planning end of things. But old topo maps, a topo map is a map of a different, they're in quadrants. I forget how many there are for Virginia, but it's a ton of them. But basically it shows the geographic features, and it shows elevations, grid lines, and stuff like that. And it also shows roads and rivers and creeks and stuff like that. But if you find one like I've got from my VDOT days, I retired in 2005. VDOT threw away all their maps. So needless to say, when I found out they were going out the door, I kind of hit Hanover hard. But I've got a map home that shows on a dotted line like you see for a trail on one of these topo maps, the route of this line coming out of Richmond, going up through Hanover County. And one thing I want to give you an idea of where it ran. Bobby Crick got this for me. You probably can't see it. I urge you to come take a look at it. This is a copy. How many of y'all know where the Garthwaite House is? It's right down the road. I think there's a cemetery there with a half-round. Almost screwed that up. There's a cemetery there with a half-round, come on, brick wall. And that line, Rappahannock Rail Line, ran right by it. Here's a picture that Bobby Crick sent me. It's called the CCC Work Project Garthwaite House. Here they are, a CCC crew during the Depression, filling in the cut. And right along the top of it is the wall of that half-round cemetery at the Garthwaite House. So that Garthwaite House is down off of Coal Harbor Road. If you know where the visitor center is for the Richmond National Battlefield Parks, it's almost across the street, but back a little bit towards Mechanicsville. But this is a picture showing them with wheelbarrows filling in the cut back during the Depression. And this blew my mind because my ancestors, they call it the Garthwaite House, but my ancestors are of the Garthwaite House, which was really a Hooper house. When Crick sent me that, I almost croaked because they're buried in that cemetery. And I had to look at it hard, and I said, Crick's right, there's the cemetery. And these are brand new bricks on top of that, so they must have just fixed that cemetery up because it was built a long time before that. It was there during the Civil War. But this railroad came out of Richmond, It ran all out down to Chickahominy, between the Chickahominy and basically Coal Harbor Road. Went over, and how many of y'all have been up down McClellan Lane from, I guess it goes down to, what is it, Black Creek? If you look, when you come off of, what's the main road coming across at West Store, crossing 360? I can't think of the road, but it might be, anyway, that road, when you go up, you get to McClellan Lane. If you take a right on McClellan Lane and follow McClellan Lane down, this railroad right-of-way and the rail cut, you're still on the right-hand side of McClellan Lane as you're going down towards Black Creek. And then it left that area through there, and it went down through the bottom and went over to Broadus' Flat. And if you know where it ended, remember where they were putting the, those of you that are from around here, remember where they were putting the outfall for the water, for the sewage treatment plant for Hanover County and all the controversy that went over it? A friend of mine, she owned that piece of land down there where they did that thing. And she's the one that put those toilets out there. She put out about 15 toilets, porcelain toilets along 360 to protest it. But see, that's a very historic site down there because that's where Newcastle was. Y'all have heard presentations on it. But Newcastle, which was a colonial port on the Pamunkey River, that was the uppermost port, was right there at Broadus' Flat. And then the port below that was Hanover Town, which is down where Grant crossed when he came down on that side of the North Anna River. That's where he crossed, and they went over and Battle Hall shop in that area. And the Rice boys' aunt, I think, owned that piece of property where Hanover Town is located. It's a historical marker down there. But there's just some neat stuff. But that's basically a quick thing. Now let me see if I can, what have I got here? All right. Those of you that can follow this, let's see. Distance 18 miles out of Central Gardens, downtown Richmond. I don't know, Central Gardens, I found it on the map, but I can't tell you exactly where it is. Area of Richmond, across Creighton Road, Dabbs House Road, Laburnum Avenue, Cedar Fork Road, remaining south of Creighton Road, due east across the Chickahominy River into Hanover, 3/4 of a mile south of Powhite, which is Dr. Gaines's house, up Bosun's Creek, just north of the White House, northeast across White House Lane, which is the road you take from Coal Harbor to get to the White House, okay, to just west of the Hooper Cemetery, which is this thing right here, to northeast along north side of Crown Hill Road, then north just west of Liggins Corner. Lenny Liggins, if you know him down there, he's the guy that had the car and the truck painted Dayglow orange. Lenny's a good guy. I know Lenny. He gave me a Hanover cart that I keep up at Caroline County Fair. If y'all want a good trip, let me digress for a minute. If you want an interesting trip, come June the 21st. There's a neat little fair just up the road, up Route 1 at Carmel Church. It's called the Caroline County Agricultural Fair. It's not a big fairground like the state fair or anything like that. It's kind of a laid-back county fair. Caroline County government has nothing to do with it. It's a private fair. It's real nice. I show and collect 19th century plows, wooden beam horse-drawn plows. That's where I keep them up there. So that's coming up June 21st for 3 days. Doesn't go to Sunday. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights. They got live music 3 nights. It's pretty good. It's worth maybe a day trip. They're not open all day long, but anyway, it gets up that way and by the White House. Madigan Creek, all right, Madigan Creek is right at the foot of the hill, right down from Lenny Liggins' farm. Then it went east of West Pond, northwest across Old Church Road. That's the road I was trying to think about. Old Church Road on Spring Run Road. If you know where Spring Run is, that cuts back out to 360, I believe. All right, northeast and parallel to Mechanicsville Turnpike down through Broadus' Flat to Newcastle. So there's your termini and the basic run of the Rappahannock line. That's Hanover's third one. It never really got going. All right, one more, and then I'm almost finished. The other one was the Ashland Trolley Line, and luckily, that's all I got on that. So it's pretty easy, but 27 January 1905, it was chartered. So there's your beginning point, 1905. And 28 October 1907, operational, it opened up. Original construction cost $994,000, 14.8 miles from Ashland to Richmond, Virginia. 19 stops, 40-minute run from Ashland Station Depot at Maple and England Streets, if you know where that is in Ashland, okay? Other stops, McMurdo Street, Francis Street, Gualtham Church Road, Cobb Street, to stop Cedar Lane, cross the Chickahominy River, to stop at Winfrey Road. Now, I don't know where all these are. I looked at them on a map, but I couldn't drive it right now. Stops at King's Crossing, Greenwood, Yellow Tavern, we know where that is, down on Route 1, basically speaking. To stop at Holly's. Holly, this is interesting. Holly, which is St. Joseph Villa Campus, that was a stop on the line. To Hilliard Road stop, to Westbrook Avenue, Lakeside Trolley Line stop. So evidently, that was your connecting point between your Richmond Trolley and Ashland Trolley. Wilma Avenue, along Brook Turnpike, Dumbarton to Chamberlain Avenue, Westbrook Avenue, Kenner Park Library is there today. Union Theological Seminary stop, which we all know where Union Theological is. The Burnham and Seminary Avenue stops, Sherwood Road, Brook stop, and down Richmond Station, 814 East Broad Street. No, West Broad Street, I'm wrong, at Laurel Street stop. Now, you know where that is? Has anybody ever seen the arts building down at VCU on Broad Street where they sold all their art supplies and everything? That was evidently the Termini in Richmond. That's where the station was. I don't remember the station, but I went to VCU, so I know where that place is down there. All right, 1917, the service stopped. That trolley line stopped. And in 1919, new investors service restarted in 1919, about 2 years later. And then 22 March 1938, the line shut down, running on deficits. Last car left Ashland at 1 a.m. Tuesday. So that's your fourth line. Anybody got questions about any of that? I've went through some stuff, but I don't see a lot of nodding off, so it must be halfway decent, interesting, something like that. But it's funny. Yes, sir. Through Tunstall? Yeah. That's going up New Kent Way. Okay. Is that what you're telling me? When you say Tunstall, I know there was another line that. Okay. I'm not familiar with that one, but I do know that there was another railroad type line that ran down that way. And it went out through, I want to say Seven Pines. What's the National Cemetery out there? Seven Pines? There was another line that I think went out that way, that there was some type of connection. I haven't gotten into the weeds on that one and picked that out yet. But they were somewhat interconnected because of electric trolley lines and things like that. Anybody else got anything on the lines? I want to just get off on a tangent because I got permission to talk about it. New Kent? That's what I thought. It's New Kent County. That's what I thought when you said Tunstall, because I think a friend of mine, Jeff Elliott, lives down that way, and some other people with the Historical Society. Yes, sir. Okay. He just said that the basic line would have gone down through Tunstall to West Point. So that's the general direction I figured, but you got the geographical knowledge. I didn't have it at my command real quick, so. All right, one last thing. Y'all live right here in this building. And right around here is some of the best history that you can find anywhere. I tell people when I talk about Hanover County, if there's any place in the United States that has any greater diversity or density of history than Hanover County, I want somebody to tell me where it is. Because if you look at it and go back to Hanover County, you got the Rev War big time through here to a large degree with Patrick Henry, and then you have the Civil War. And during the Civil War, a lot of people don't realize this, but during the war just in Hanover County, Virginia, 250,000 men faced each other on the battlefield over the course of the years during the Civil War in Hanover County. That's a lot of people. in the skirmishes. But the point I'm making is, in 2019, did any of y'all ever know Bob Bluford? I know Bob Tate probably knew him. You knew him. Bob was the guy, then you know where Pole Green Church is, all right? Bob is the guy that basically did Pole Green Church. He was a retired Presbyterian minister, for those of you that know him or don't know him. A lot of people don't know two things that I know about him. It's out there a little bit. He was a World War II bombardier pilot. He ran all of his missions, came home safe, got out, went to school, Hampton, Sydney. But how many of y'all know that he started the Fan Free Clinic down at VCU, where all the free health care was back in my days, the 60s, VCU and everything? He's credited with starting that Fan Free Clinic down there. But I'm sitting at work one day, and phone rings. Now, I'm at 14th and Broad Street. 10 minutes, I'm sitting in the State Library in front of a microfilm reader doing genealogy, okay? Phone rings. How many of y'all ever heard Bob Bluford speak? All right, he's very distinct in his speech. He was a great Presbyterian minister. He calls me up. He says, phone rings. I said, Art Taylor, right away. He says, Mr. Taylor? I said, oh, darn, who is this? I already knew that he was probably a lot older than I was, the way that he talked, and he called me Mr. Taylor. So I said, well, I better get on my P's and Q's. So anyway, he says, I understand that you go over to the State Library quite often. I said, this isn't good. Here I am working for the state. And anyway, he says, would you do me a favor? I said, yes, sir. Now, I didn't know him from Adam. I had just heard him. And he says he's looking for descriptions of Pole Green Church, okay? He says Thomas Hooper wrote an article in 1895 in the Richmond Dispatch. Was it the Richmond Dispatch or the Times Dispatch? Anyway, and he said, I'd like for you to go over there and get that article, because in this article is the interior description of Pole Green Church, the only description he had at the time and knew of. Somebody had sent it to him. So I went and got it. And like a dummy, I made the mistake of looking at the other 5 or 6 in there that Tom Hooper wrote. Long story short, I got that for him. And then once I copied the other ones and read them, I said, man, this is too good. So what I did in 2019, I took those articles. I took articles by Mary Jane, an article by Mary Jane Hall, 2 of them. One on my visits to grandmother, where she lived at the White House. She went over to the White House to her grandmother's house and learned how to make quilts as a little girl. And then Mary Jane wrote an article on Studley. And then her brother wrote some Civil War articles, the Boys of Horse Shop, the Battle of Horse Shop, stuff like that. But I compiled it, and this book is on Amazon, and I've got some copies tonight. But if you read this thing, it's some of the great reading, not because I compiled it, but Bluford put me on it. And it's about right here where you all are. It's all around you. Oak Grove, Enon Church, Salem Church, Beulah Church, Ellerson's Mill, Gaines Mill, White House, Garthright House, all of them. It's a good little book, and I just wanted to mention it. I brought some extra copies along, and I'll sign it if you want. It's $20. It's $20 on Amazon, plus $5 to ship it, plus pay the governor. So it probably cost you $27, $28 or something like that. But anyway, any more questions? I enjoyed it. Thank you for dinner. I appreciate the dinner. And things like this just are fun to do. And y'all have been a great group, because, like I said, everybody seemed to stay awake, and I did too after eating that meal. So thank y'all.
Yes, thank you again for coming. And for anyone who wants to come up, like he said, and look and handle all the stuff up here, I got a sneak peek earlier when he was setting it up, so it's very interesting. But thank you for coming, for those who watch the broadcast, and everyone have a good evening.